Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Paweł Lewicki. I'm the Associate Director of the European Studies Center at the University of Pittsburgh. Welcome to another session of Europe Today, our spring virtual lecture series. Our lecturer and guest today is Professor Reinhard Heinisch. Reinhard is a professor of comparative Austrian politics at the Department of Political Science at the University of Salzburg, which he is chairing since 2009. Previously, he was a faculty member at the University of Pittsburgh, and he still is an affiliate at this European Studies Center, so with us here too. Reinhard's main research interests are centered on comparative populism, Euroscepticism, political parties, the radical right, and democracy. In his current research project under Horizon 2020 grant by the European Union, with the title Populism and Civic Engagement, he studies supply and demand side factors fostering radical populism and examines effective civic countermeasures. His other current work is concerned with how people actually understand democracy. Here, Reinhard is particularly interested in innovative survey designs. Besides this, he is exploring populism and the COVID-19 pandemics in a research that is supported by a grant from the Swiss and Austrian research funds, in which he focuses on conjunction between populism, conspiracy theories, and the COVID-19 pandemics. Within this research, he is doing various surveys in various European countries. Reinhard's research has appeared in various academic journals, such as the Journal of Common Market Studies, Political Studies, the European Journal of Political Research, Party Politics, West European Politics and Democratization, among many others. In 2018, he co-edited a special issue of Comparative European Politics on the territorial dimension in party-based populism. His book publications in English include The People and the Nation, People and Ethno-Territorial Politics in Europe, that was published with Routledge in 2019, Political Populism, Handbook of Concepts, Questions and Strategies of Research, that was published with Nomos in 2021, and Understanding Populist Organization, the West European Radical Right, that was published in 2016 with Palgrave. Reinhard's title today is Radical Populism and Its Challenges to European Democracy, Insights from Austria. And without further ado, I'm handing over to Reinhard. Oh, no, sorry, not so fast. After Professor Reinhard's Heinisch talk, we will have the opportunity to enter into conversation. Please feel free to ask any questions through the Q&A box that you can see below in your Zoom app. I will read these questions and include them into our conversation after Professor Heinisch talk. So now I can hand over to Reinhard. Thank you, Reinhard, for being with us tonight.
So I'm absolutely delighted to be here. Thank you very much for the invitation. And as was already mentioned, I feel a very close connection to Pittsburgh and University of Pittsburgh, which was so instrumental in my particularly early on in my academic life. And the irony is that Pitt, and particularly the Center of European Studies, was very instrumental in shaping my research agenda. I had been working on something completely different when there were a series of political developments in Austria, and the European Studies Center was putting a workshop together and asked me to look into this, and I started to develop an interest in populism, and that was pretty much around the year 2000. And I thought I would just do this very briefly, and I'll then go back to what I was doing before. But I've sort of stuck with populism research, and I have a presentation that I would like to share with you, and hope you can see the presentation now.
Yes.
And essentially, the title of my talk is sort of radical populism and its challenges to European democracy, insights from Austria. Now, I've even when I was at Pitt, I was working on Austria, but I'm keenly aware that Austria is not a terribly important country. But however, a smaller country can sometimes be helpful in understanding connections because certain things are so streamlined and more clearly visible. So I will talk about Austria to some extent, but I try to make it relate to broader questions, and you will see that what we see in Austria is also something that we see in Europe more generally, more broadly, with respect to populism. If you're interested in my research, you're welcome to write to me. There's my email address, and there is also my website. And as already mentioned, I had two larger grants of late that have sustained and supported my research. So when we talk about the challenges of populism, we have to say that just over the last 10 years, the share of support for radical populist parties, and I know I haven't defined that yet. Please bear with me. I'll get to that in a minute. But let's assume before we talk, we're sort of clear what populist parties are. The share of populist parties has significantly increased just over the last decade. So between 5 and 6% has gone up to close to 25 to 30% in the Eurozone alone. The Eurozone are the countries that use the euro. And these are the most stable and most developed European democracies. And we can imagine if there is a challenge from radical outsider parties or anti-system parties, anti-establishment parties in the Eurozone, we can imagine how strong to some extent the influence of these parties is in lesser developed European democracies. We can also use a different measure. For example, on here, the two maps, compare the situation in 2000, 2017. The darker the bluish shade, the stronger the voting support or the voter support. But if you look at the outlines of the countries, the dark outlines, the thick outlines show you populists in power, or the thinner outlines of the country show you populists in government coalitions. And if you compare just eyeballing 2000, 2017, you see not only an increase in the voting support in those 17 years, but you also see that populists have actually begun entering government and exercising and wielding power much more clearly, as you can see, in the countries that where democracies were not fully consolidated, more in Eastern Europe and more in Southeastern and Southern Europe, but also in other parts of Europe. There's really no country that has been sort of spared. And for a long time, we thought certain countries are immune to that phenomenon, but in reality, we've seen radical populism take off in country after country. So then, if we shift to briefly to Austria, now that was also the reason why I was initially drawn to studying populism. There is this person. His name was Jörg Haider. Jörg Haider was a dashing, charismatic, young right-wing politician who was a gifted orator who was very good looking, and he was sort of a new type of politician. And he became the leader of a rather insignificant far-right party in Austria that had never won more than 5% of the votes. And Haider, in many ways, was a trailblazer. He set the trend, and he created positions, or he remolded his party in a way that would be a model for others to follow. He pioneered a lot of the slogans and the positions that we now commonly associate with populist parties. I've sort of you see here the Trump you see the image of Trump, where Trump in a tweet said, in reality, they're not after me, they're after you. Similar slogans were already, were spouted by this young Austrian in the 1980s. They're against him because he's for you, or Austria first, like Trump's America first, or like Trump's the deep state. Haider also had the idea there's a corrupt state, as a sort of deep state of sorts, but he and his party, they're the untouchables, they're the incorruptibles, and you see that in a poster below. And Haider also sort of repositioned his party from a pro-EU party, pro-European integration party, into an anti-European integration party. And on top of it, you see the image of this woman presented as with the headscarf, but draped in the European Union flag, sort of having the twin, for the Austrian populists, the twin evils, the European Union and Muslim immigration, or immigration from Muslim majority countries. And Haider particularly made the issue of immigration at that time from Turkey a major political issue. So Haider was in many ways someone who pioneered this, what was then a new phenomenon in the 1980s, and took his party from 5% to almost 30% within a span of 20 years. And it's hard to believe that a provincial Austrian politician, the leader of a minor Austrian party, made it onto the title pages, the cover pages of major American magazines. He's the only Austrian politician ever to be mentioned, that I've seen mentioned in an undergraduate political science text. And I'll never remember, I was doing consulting work for the State Department. I was driving back from Washington to Pittsburgh, and I was going along the turnpike, and I pulled over somewhere and went into some local restaurant. And at this local place, I saw the local newspaper. And, local newspapers often in the US can be extremely local. They barely mention anything beyond the region. And I saw a picture of this Austrian politician plastered on the title page of that paper. And the caption, the headline said, "Is this the most dangerous man in Europe?" ? And that gives you a sense of the impact of this person and this phenomenon. And when his party was ended up in a government coalition in 2000 with the Conservatives, the other European governments were so frightened by Haider that they imposed sanctions on the fellow member state of the European Union, sort of the other 11, there were 11 member states at the time, the other 11 member states sanctioning the Austrian government that contained the party by Haider. That party is called the Austrian Freedom Party. Haider sort of died prematurely in 2008 in that car accident, which actually made him a martyr to his followers. Lots of conspiracy theories that the Israelis killed him or the CIA went after him. And there was a tremendous outpouring of support. And but while Haider is no longer leader of the Freedom Party, but the Freedom Party is still very much a very strong party, and it still very much plays a role in Austria. And if we look at the composition of the voters of the Freedom Party, we see, when we look at this graph, which shows us a slice of the Freedom Party performance between 1986 and 2013, we see, first of all, it's not a linear development. It's very much up and down. The Freedom Party rises, becomes more popular when it is in opposition, ends up in government, and then something happens, it explodes, it crashes, it collapses, it loses voters, and then the whole process starts again. One of the one article, a publication of mine in West European Politics, is the most frequently cited one, was failure success in opposition, failure in government. And that pretty much describes the situation of many populist parties, and particularly of the Austrian Freedom Party. What you also see here, the composition of his voters. So a radical populist party does not just have voters who are less educated, who are in the working class, or older. It's usually a coalition of voters. But if we look at the coalition, it is clearly more prominent among blue-collar voters than white-collar voters. and it's least supported by voters or citizens with post-secondary education. But nonetheless, it's sort of a broader coalition of voters, but it is clearly voters who tend to be feel less represented by the established political parties. But let's move on to see, okay, what do we mean by populism? So what is populism? And that's a term that is rather ubiquitous. We read it a lot, and and populism seems to be everywhere these days. But if a term is everywhere, it loses its analytical meaning, because then it's sort of anything goes. Now, there are different conceptions of populism. So there's not a right or a wrong definition, but besides definitions, there are actually conceptions or conceptualizations of what populism is. So populism, for example, could be a political style. Populism could be also a strategy. And populism, the way I conceive it, the way I and many colleagues of mine use it, it's understood as a set of ideas, as a we call a thin ideology. Now, a populist political style means, politicians use language that makes them connect with people, with ordinary people. They simplify things. They use very emotional language, emotive terms to sort of break through and come across as an authentic person in many ways. And it's often oversimplification. It's often exaggeration. It's often presenting things in very stark binary terms. We can disagree about what is a good or bad political style, but I would argue that populist political style is probably as old as democracy. And one can criticize that and criticize parties, but I think populist style is just a very common part of American democracy and many democracies, and I'm not greatly concerned about it. Populism as a strategy essentially means that parties that are inherently not populist themselves, they pursue certain goals, but for one reason or another, they need to punch through, they need to be taken seriously, they need to be heard. So they engage in a kind of discourse that may be outrageous, that draws attention, that may be over the top. And again, it's something that one can research, and it's a legitimate issue for research. But again, it's not what I would mean when I talk about populism here. So I call this, or I refer to this as a set of ideas. So what are the ideas that make up populism? The fundamental idea of a populist is that populism refers to the idea there's an antagonistic relationship between people and elites. So in other words, there's nothing in between. So the people and the elites are inherent enemies, and the people are described as pure, as true, as forgotten, and the elites are invariably corrupt or nefarious. And the elites impose their self-serving agenda on the people, and thereby the elites undermine the will of the people. That means the people are not passport holders, they're not voters, they're not citizens. The people are seen as the people are an abstraction. They're homogeneous. There's no difference of class and interest. And normally in political science, we would say, well, people are different, they're diverse, they're different by age, by interest, by upbringing, by gender, and so on and so forth, by education, and by the location where they live, and that shapes their political preference, and that shapes their interests. Populists would say, no, the people are one, the people are homogenous, and if you are not part of the people, you're essentially, if you don't share that, you're not part of the people. So the people are an abstraction. The enemies of the people, the elites, are also an abstraction, and they are situationally defined. So the elites may be the swamp you need to drain, the traditional parties, the political class, Washington, the national capital, or the bankers, the millionaires, the rich, the European Union, outgroups such as immigrants, whoever supposedly threatens the people. And again, that is an abstraction. The important thing is the elites are seen as illegitimate. Populists also engage in what we call a Manichaean worldview. The Manichaeans, sort of from the Bible, are people that perceive the world in binary terms, in black and white terms, and therefore you're either with the people or you're with their enemies. There's really no compromise. There's no middle ground. So populists are very skeptical of pluralism, diversity, and compromise, because if you believe the people are everything, how could you compromise with the will of the people? That's, it's excluded anyway. And if you feel differently, you probably not, you shouldn't be, they wouldn't take you seriously anyway, or they think you're part of you're an enemy of the people. And when you look at the programs or the rhetoric, and I can't show you the party programs, and we can't listen to speeches here, but posters are very good representations of party manifestos, and you can see sort of the way populists talk about the people. So the people, like you see here, as a poster by the Austrian Freedom Party, it says at the lower left of the screen, it says, "To the people, they're right. That people, they are right." Or terms like the heartland, or the real Austrian, the real Americans, the hardworking Americans. So if you think about these terms, okay, who are the non-real Austrians? Where's exactly is the heartland? Where does the heartland start? What's the first town of the heartland? Where does it end? Where does it start? So these are the kinds of terms that are abstractions, but they conjure up a certain image. They include a lot of people, but they exclude others. And then, of course, there are the enemies. And you see on the poster on the right here, this colleague Austrian village, and then you see the immigrant presented as some ninja fighter or gangster with the gun drawn. And sort of that's the image of the enemy of the people, the immigrant coming in and threatening. Or the British UKIP party sort of European flag burning through the British flag, meaning that the European Union is like a puppet master in the back, running the lives of the Brits. Sort of these sort of conceptions. And here you see very nicely is a Czech poster and a Slovak poster, the Manichaean, the sort of binary worldview. So you see on the Czech poster on the left, all the things that are evil. There is ISIS, there's the United States, Uncle Sam. There are blacks. There's nuclear explosions, and then on the other hand, you have everything's wonderful. It's bucolic. It is happy white people, of course. And then you also on the poster next to it, is gay love. There's the European Union. There's George Soros, a billionaire who is often associated by the radical right with evil intentions. And then on the other side, you see bucolic, traditional Slovaks, and they're all happy. And you it's almost comical because it's such a cartoonish exaggeration. But in many ways, it very simple communication can be sometimes quite effective. So the attributes of populism are populism promises radical change. But the interesting thing is populism promises change. So in the present, populism promises you that the future will be more like the past. So it's change towards something that is familiar. So it's not change that is unsettling change, but if you're frustrated by what you're experiencing, we will deliver, we will save the people by restoring an imagined, idealized past community where everything is familiar as it was and as it should be. Make America great again. And virtually all radical populist parties also in Europe have similar versions of that promise. Populists are credible change agents. That means, like, if I went out there and promised change, people would say, well, who are you and how can we believe you? Populists are somehow capable of translating resources they have, communication resources, social resources, economic resources, and translate those into political resources. Think about Donald Trump, an entertainer, a celebrity, and was able to translate that he was famous, his fame, and his media savvy into a political career. And what is also very important, populism is not anti-democratic per se. Populism is opposed to liberal democracy. Liberal democracy is essentially a form of democracy where the majoritarian will of the people is constrained, is limited by checks and balances, by the constitution, the court, and it is criticized by the media. And populists see any infringement, any constraint on the will of the people, the majority will of the people, as an inherent problem, as an affront. Populism, like all ideologies, provides answers to the question, what's wrong? In this case, Austria being run by the European Union, who's to blame? Foreigners. And what is to be done? Kick them out. Now, because populism doesn't have a very elaborate idea system, it's just this basic idea, the elites subvert the will of the people. Populist parties cannot offer a value system of solutions on their own. So they borrow solutions, they borrow a value system from other ideas, from radical right and radical left ideologies. So we call them host ideologies. And therefore we have radical right and radical left populist parties. Here on the poster, on the slide, you see two radical left parties, left populist parties, the Greek party Syriza and the Spanish party Podemos, and then the Front National, or the National Rally, as it is now called in France, and the Italian Lega, led by their respective leaders. Additional features of populist parties are that we distinguish between extremist far-right parties, like the neo-Nazis, and radical populist parties. Extremist parties tend to be prone to violence, and they're anti-democratic. Populists do not call for violence. Populists do not want to shut down parliament. They run for office, and they take part in the democratic process. Populist parties are also very flexible. They're very opportunistic, and they sort of have a knack for sensing what is a popular topic. They can seize on this. Like now, I'll show you then the war in Ukraine or COVID were issues that populist parties, for example, in Austria and Germany, have seized on, and they use this as a wedge issue against other parties. A famous populism scholar, Paul Taggart, who got his PhD from Pitt, called this the chameleon-like, the chameleonic feature of populism. So when we in political science look at a political phenomenon, we can study either the politicians, the policymakers, and their programs and their speeches. That's called the supply side. Or we can study the demand side, the voters, the citizens, their mindsets, their attitudes. Let's briefly look at both sides and let's look at the question of populism. Let's start with the demand side. And my own work sort of focuses on both. So let's ask ourselves, okay, who are the populist sympathizers? If we build sort of a profile of European populists, who are they? If we take the best available current survey data, for those of you who are interested in this, it's the Comparative Studies of Electoral Systems, Module 5.3. Came out 2 years ago, and they included a battery of populism indicator questions. They ran that survey in virtually all of Europe, but in some countries the questions were different. But in these 15 countries, the questions are identical. And we can look at all the voters. We can pull the voters from all these countries. And then we can also look at another data set. It's called Populist. And in Populist, you find country experts have identified 34 bona fide populist parties out of 205 European parties. And so we can now see, okay, let's take all the voters in these 15 countries, and let's see who are the voters that voted for any one of these 34 European parties. And then we can sort of build a profile. And when we build a profile, we can start with a socio-demographic profile. So we look at age, gender, education, income, employment status, and religion, and see which of these features makes someone more likely to vote for a radical populist party. And we find, ignore the statistics, ignore the table, I just put it there so it doesn't look like I just made this up. And we can see that in terms of the social demographic profile across these European countries, they're more likely to be male, they're more likely to have a middle to low education, they tend to be lower income, they are active in the labor force, so they're less likely to be retired or homemakers, and they're not religious. If we then look at the second step, what is their attitude towards democracy? And we ask, are they close or distant to traditional parties? Are they left or are they right? Are they satisfied with democracy, or do they like a strong leader? And what we find here is they're not close to any other party. They are more ideologically on the right than they're on the left. They do desire a strong leader, and they're highly dissatisfied with the way democracy works. If we want to know what kind of policies do they favor, we find that they favor leftist social policies, which is interesting. They tend to be more on the right overall, but they favor leftist social policies. So they favor state intervention to protect people. They favor government spending on social programs. But they're also very strongly anti-immigration. And then finally, we have to test whether they do believe in these three populist ideas: anti-elite, people-centered, and Manichaean, binary. And indeed, there is a strong and significant relationship between these ideas and being being a likely voter of one of the radical populist parties. Of course, there are national differences between countries. There are 1,000 reasons for why people vote for a particular party. But if we strip all this away, that remains as the profile. And it gives us a sense who these voters are. Populists work very much, they're very good at mobilizing people based on sentiment and emotion. So that plays a major role. And we sort of imagine the process, how this works, that people are exposed to global change at the global level, factories closing, there's a war going on in Ukraine, there's a COVID, there's a pandemic, and lots of things are happening. And that forces people, that percolates down to the individual level and forces people to adapt. And not all people are equally equipped don't have the resources to adapt to adjust to these threats. So that creates insecurity. The insecurity, if you fail to adjust, translates into fear, into anxiety, into rage, and that makes you more likely to vote for a party or for politicians that promise you change towards greater security or towards the more familiar. And in one of the European surveys, in the European Values Survey, there was a question about lack of control, where people were asked, do you feel you have control over your lives? Can you control the things that affect you, people that affect you, or events, developments that affect you? So we looked at that question. I mean, we ran a model, but I can show you this in a more intuitive way. If we list all the political parties across Europe, or major political parties across Europe from different countries, and we group them by the percentage of respondents who said they have lost control, they have lack of control, we noticed that the black bars are all over to the left, and the black bars include a lot more people. The percentage of people say who we have no control are in these black bars. And if we move from the left to the right on this graph that we increasingly see that the bars get smaller, and we increasingly see gray bars. The black bars represent the populist parties, and the gray bars represent the mainstream parties. But we can see here visually that the percentage of people in the populist parties, of people who say I have no control over my lives, is actually much larger. And we can actually then we can calculate this and run a model and show that that holds true for across the sample. I can also show you something here, how insecurity or loss of control makes other attitudes harder. Let's imagine the following. Here we're looking at a group of voters, and we try to figure out the probability to vote for the German populist AfD. That's the Alternative for Germany. And here we see 0% probability, 20% probability, 40% probability, 60% probability. And we split our sample into two groups. There's people pro-immigration and people against immigration. So if we look at the left panel, we see at the corner, these are the people That's the percentage of people, the mean of people saying we have no loss of control. We're fine with control, and we're pro-immigration. Almost no probability to vote for the populists because they're just not interested in what they have to offer. Then we look at people who are also for immigration, but they have experienced a loss of control, but we see barely an increase in the probability to vote for the radical populist. So in this case, loss of control doesn't really make much of a difference. For people who are happy in favor of immigration, that doesn't do anything. Let's look at the other sample. This is the group of people that are against immigration. And here, for the people who are against immigration, we see here those people who have no loss of control problem. They're slightly under 20% willing, probable to vote for the German populists. But watch what happens if we add loss of control to the mix. Here, these are the people who are against immigration and experience loss of control, and the propensity to vote for a radical populist party shoots up to almost 40%. So you can see a strengthening effect, how some of these variables often interact with each other. Let me move on to the supply side. So I think we've talked about the voters. So let's talk about parties and why parties offer what they're offering. And as I said, the way you analyze parties, with the demand side, we do surveys. I do often survey experiments, or you do when you look at the supply side, you look at you analyze speeches or you analyze texts, and there are different ways in which machine learning, you can try to find patterns, and then you analyze social media information, you do web scraping, and so on to understand what is the position of a political party or position of a political actor. And you see some of this sort of reflected here in the posters. And you can see, so immigration and identity and security are the three important issues. So identity questions, immigration is on top of identity, a special sub-issue that is super important, and then security questions. So where does this come from? So we can imagine the typical political spectrum. And in the economic spectrum, we have the difference between the economic left and the economic right. And here we have contestation over economic issues, sort of more or less state intervention in the economy, more freedom versus more equality, more redistribution of resources versus great individual freedom. And that has resulted in the familiar center-left and center-right political parties that we see across Europe, but we see in all Western democracies. In Austria, the Austrian Conservatives, the Austrian People's Party, and the Social Democrats. However, over time, as many of the material needs were met and the question of material existence and as economic questions were no longer as important for everyone as they had been maybe 50, 60 or 100 years ago, a second axis came into existence. An axis where the contestation was over, the fighting was over sociocultural issues. Sometimes the axis is also drawn at an angle, but for simplicity's sake, I have it here perpendicular to the other axis. And the second axis goes, the sociocultural axis goes by a different name. In Europe, we often refer to it as Galtan, green, alternative, and liberal versus traditional, authoritarian, national, freedom and security, cosmopolitan, or communitarian. And in the 1970s, 80s, 90s, we have new parties that emerged there because there was empty space, and political systems hate empty space. The Greens and the Liberals found voters there. Of course, there was still empty space on the other side, on the security side, on the tradition side, and that is where the radical populists, maybe the radical right-wing populists, position themselves. But because they're in economic terms actually somewhat to the left, they actually have an interesting position. So they're very far to the right on cultural questions, but they're actually more to the left of traditional conservative parties. And when we look at the Austrian context, this is already getting to the last part of the presentation. Like many Western societies, sort of Austrian society is divided between people who are more communitarian, more traditional, and people who live in the major cities and are much more cosmopolitan and outward looking. And that has an effect also in politics. In 2015, for example, Austria had presidential elections. And Austria does not have a presidential system, so this is not a head of government, but this is a head of state election. But in the runoff, what was very interesting, you had a Green Party candidate and a Freedom Party, so a radical right, populist radical right party candidate and a liberal Green Party candidate. Sort of the two polar opposites of the sociocultural spectrum were directly clashing and were in direct confrontation. And you see the result. Blue is where the counties in Austria where the majority, where the Freedom Party had a majority, and green, the major urban centers where the Green Party had a majority. And you can sort of see, it looks like an islands of green surrounded by a lot of blue in the more thinly populated rural areas. So what are some of the things we need to focus on now? So the big story or the interesting feature is the relationship between the conservatives and the radical right populists. You see, the populists in a multi-party system as in Europe, and that's different between Europe and the United States, the populists very rarely gain more than 30%. So they need a coalition if they ever wanted to get into government. And the coalition is usually formed with the conservatives. So the behavior, the attitude of the Conservative Party is very instrumental in how successful the populists can be. And in Austria, the conservatives and the populists were twice in a coalition in 2000, and then the second time between 2017 and 2019. And here we see on the right a very young man who was one of the youngest politicians in Europe to become head of government. He was the Chancellor of Austria. He was the head of the Conservative Party. And he forged and formed a coalition with the radical right Freedom Party, represented by the person on the left. But he wasn't just doing a coalition as they had done 18 years before, or 17 years before, but he actually wanted to overtake the populists in their own agenda, but sort of with their own agenda. So he was trying to actually steal voters away from the populists by actually moving his own party, opening his party to the right, and adopting a significant part of the Conservative Party agenda. And you can see the meme here. You see the young this young Sebastian Kurz looking over the shoulder of the populist leader and copying the information. We did a paper on this where we compared. We did a text analysis where we compared the programs, and we also calculated, and we found out that the voters actually didn't want the Conservative Party to move to the right. It was pretty much a strategic decision by the conservatives to move to the right in order to attract voters, steal voters away from the populists. What happens when you do this? So the conservatives are quite successful. They gained a lot of voters, and we could show that a lot of voters switched from the radical right to the conservatives. But when the Conservative Party does that, it validates the agenda that the radical right has, and eventually the government collapsed. But eventually the radical right came back with that same agenda. And of course, the agenda now is perceived as a valid agenda because a mainstream party also at one point had adopted that agenda. So this idea of stealing voters from the radical right can backfire if things change. And then the radical right can sort of say that, look, the agenda now is validated. Just a quick note, the second government coalition also collapsed, and it collapsed because a video surfaced where there was secretly taped that showed the leader of the radical right here in this picture after having done cocaine and being visibly drunk, being shown with a suspected Russian, an oligarch, a Russian female blonde millionaire, and trading influence for financial inducement. So if the then chancellor, then vice chancellor of Austria was sort of selling away media access to a foreign millionaire, and that is sort of tape that doesn't look good, and the party that this person had to resign, and as a result the government collapsed. It became known as the Ibiza affair. We don't have to go into details here. What I just want to underscore is populists do quite well in opposition, but when they are in government, they often lack the qualification, they lack the aptitude to then have the personnel that you need to execute policy, or to stand up to the scrutiny that you have as a government official versus when you're an opposition figure. Nonetheless, once they're in opposition, they collapse in government, they lose 2/3 of their voters, but within a few years they come back. So they're very good at tapping into grievances, into frustration, and to make a comeback. And this is the current leader. So within a few years, they've come back. And again, you have the same slogans. But when you look at current opinion polls, the radical populists are still again in first place. So within few years after the collapse in 2019, just in 2023 now, the Freedom Party is 29% and is far ahead of all the other parties. And if we had elections, if Austria's elections later this year and next year, the Freedom Party stands to do extremely well, all things being equal. Why is this a challenge to democracy? It's just to, at the very end, answer the question to the talk. Well, first of all, I think what we say about the Austrian Freedom Party holds true for many radical populist parties across Western Europe. For example, currently in the war in the Ukraine, these parties are very close to Russia. They see in Russia, in Putin, an anti-American force, an anti-liberal force. They see in Moscow as a way of containing and constraining the liberal agenda that they associate with Washington and with Brussels. In this particular case, they don't defend Russian aggression, but they reframe the conflict saying, oh, well, Austria should be neutral, and the whole thing just serves to expand US interests. And the West sort of drove the Russians into this position. And by the way, it wasn't even clear whether Ukraine really is a real country. And at the end, no one asked the Austrians whether the EU should impose sanctions. And by the way, the sanctions are ineffective and counterproductive. The populists, the Freedom Party, was very active in mobilizing against COVID measures, accusing the government of wasting money on vaccines, criticizing experts, criticizing lockdowns, and sort of accusing the government of locking up people. They oppose the European Union and they try to establish alliances at the European level. So you see the Austrian populist leader with the German populists here, and they have great admiration for Eurosceptic leaders like Hungary's Viktor Orban. They take a very tough stance on asylum and immigration. They want to close the borders. They want to create detention centers, automatic deportation, and they currently have this the slogan of Austria should be converted into a fortress. They oppose climate policies. They're very critical of the Clean Deal. They think this will kill off European industry. This will be for the benefit of China and the US. And they say the politicians listen to protesters, but don't listen to the common sense of ordinary people. And finally, I think radical populist parties show their opposition to liberal democracy by trying to weaken institutions, the media institution, weaken the courts, and weaken government institutions in order to sort of allow the free will or the majority will of the people to dominate. I mean, the leader of the Freedom Party famously said, it's the law that has to follow politics, not politics the law. And they shift the political discourse. So, for example, they would make statements such as Austria is the most stupid, deceitful, and sadistic government in Europe, or they present the governor, the female governor of a major state in Austria, a major province, in a Muslim headscarf. So she was, because she's supposedly very friendly to Muslims, or they show sort of immigrants as threatening Austrian villages. Sort of, they very much radicalize the political discourse. So these are the last two slides. So if I were to ask what is the effect of radical populism, we see, first of all, a radicalization of the political climate. We have sort of the stoking of culture wars. We see a shifting of the societal consensus. We see a radicalization of mainstream parties who pulled apart and pulled, particularly by the populists, by the radical populists towards them. And we see a destabilization or an undermining of state institution, of democratic institutions. So if populists have significant power, I mean, they're still constrained because very often they are in coalitions. What threatens, if they're really powerful, we see examples of this in Hungary and to some extent in Poland, what threatens is either illiberal democracy from below, sort of a majoritarianism through mobilized masses, that sort of the street dominates, the politics of the street, or we see an authoritarian democracy, sort of a state organized from above without opposition and civil society. And I think these are the things that provide us with sleepless nights. And I think this is why many of us who studied phenomena are so keenly interested in it. And with that, I would like to thank you. And I stop my screen sharing and hope it was interesting. Thank you.
Sorry, the usual thing. Thank you, Reinhard, for this overview of populism and very insightful talk. I don't see any questions, and we don't have a lot of time. But I would like to ask you a question on the one hand, on specificity of Austria and then comparability. So, I think I belong to a generation that can still remember Haida, who was really the first populist, and the whole Europe like being totally afraid. And I remember Jacques Chirac at that time, president of France, threatening not to invite Austrians to the summits of European Council and stuff like that. So Austria was in a way, the first country where populism became so prominent. So I wonder if you have any answer to that. And then on the other hand, you said about the overtaking of the agenda of the right conservatives, taking agenda of right populists by right conservatives or conservatives just. And it's happening everywhere. But I think also about Denmark, where actually Social Democrats took over the populist anti-immigrant and won the elections. But anyway, the taking over of the agendas, and we see it in many different countries. Do you think it's something that also started in Austria?
So I think Austria, the significance of Austria is because Austria is, whatever we say, it's a West European, it's a Western democracy. So Austria doesn't have the excuse that institutions are not well developed, democracy is not well entrenched. Austria, like Germany, has had long period of stable democratic institutions after the war. And there is a difference whether a country that is rich, that is developed, that has stable institutions, does something versus a country that hasn't developed, where the party system is very fluid, and that's sort of in transition, and where democracy is in transition. So I think it's, as a Western country, it draws attention. Then there's the connection to Germany, because there is an affinity. I mean, the Austrians pay a lot of attention to Germany, but also Haida had some influence, of course, in Germany, and Austria in many ways because it's a smaller setting, but things that happen in Austria are also looked at. And there is an affinity between the German far right and the Austrian far right. There's an Austrian identitarian movement that was actually more popular in Germany than it was in Austria. And then, of course, there's the Nazi connection. So in the Anglo-Saxon world, the Austrian Freedom Party has a tangible connection to, former Nazis and war veterans. So, you pay attention to the Austrian radical right and rather than to the Danish radical right because of that historical connection. And that's when I get questions from whenever the radical right does something in Austria, I get a lot of international questions from international media. And when they ask me, there's always the sort of the Nazis in the background. And I don't think it's the Nazi story that's so significant. I think it is, in many ways, they're not Nazis, but they're populists and they've reinvented themselves. And I think that makes them dangerous. And I think the problem with the sanctions was, I think, because it was such an overreaction to the Freedom Party, that when they should have reacted, the European Union, when indeed we saw populism becoming more prominent, particularly in Hungary, that the European Union didn't do anything because of the overreaction, and the climb down resulted in basically not doing something when they should have done it and should have put the foot down. And I think so the Austrian story is very tragic, that it probably contributed to a lame reaction later on, and it should have been handled differently.
Mm-hmm. And what about the taking over the agenda? Do you think that was the also Austrian invention, or is it like a general?
No, I think there was very much. I think in 2000 it was the very first. I mean, depending how you look at Italy, in Italy there was a coalition between Berlusconi and the Lega, and you could say actually that was really the first case. But in Austria it was quite clear, because Heinisch was such an iconic figure, and it was such a clear, it was such a clear phenomenon. The research, there's some colleague of mine, Tariq Abuchadi, who looks at that. He now teaches at Oxford, who sort of, is well known in his research, where he looks at what happens when major parties take over the agenda. And the argument is, well, we could defang the radical populists. We take the agenda and we weaken them. But the evidence is simply to the contrary. I mean, the strategies that has been used, for example, in Belgium, by freezing them out permanently, it actually weakens them, because over time, the voters of a radical populist party still wants the party to have influence in government. If they're permanently frozen out because they're so radical, voters lose interest. So I think that the Belgium example is an example where you can actually weaken it. While in the Austrian, it's the counterexample. So they were twice in government, and as a result, they're stronger every time on the agenda. Their agenda is validated. So it's not clear. Now, the Danish case is a well-known case, but I think there's been much mythologized. So it's true that the Danish left, so the Social Democrats, adopted some of the agenda. But on the other hand, the previous government had been in power for a long time. It was actually quite unpopular, so they were poised to lose. And when you look at a lot of voters that would have voted for the Social Democrat, voted for the Greens and other leftist parties. So it was sort of a swapping of voters. So yes, they did well, and that worked for them, but the lost voters in the other direction. I think if the Austrian Social Democrats, for example, were to adopt that kind of agenda, and they're split, they would like to, there's a wing of the Social Democrats that wants to move closer to the Freedom Party, but then they would lose voters on the other side. So if the mainstream parties move in any direction, they lose voters on the other side. So I think in the end, it's a toss-up. I don't think that's a strategy that is very successful, very promising for the major parties. Why the Conservatives were so successful in their last coalition was because the leader of the Conservatives was just a politically extremely gifted. It was just a political phenomenon. Had a different leader, and they're trying this now currently, and it's not working so well. So, getting elected by people needs. There are a number of reasons why people vote for a political party. Just stealing the agenda from the radical right, if you're not credible in this, it doesn't help you very much. But it does help
to validate and to showcase their agenda. And I think voters, if they get a choice, rather go to the one who can deliver than to the one who sort of just adopted the agenda yesterday in some way. So I think that would be my sense of it.
I wonder what Friedrich Merz is saying to this, and if he's going to succeed or not in the upcoming elections in Germany.
Yeah.
Okay, I think we ran out of time. Thank you so much for joining us, and thank you for the lecture, Professor Heinisch. Thank you everyone for listening to our guest speaker. I have one announcement regarding next week. We regretfully have to cancel next week's lecture. Our guest had to cancel due to family reasons. We will also notify everyone in advance. Please visit our webpage to have a look at other lectures that we already hosted, and we will see each other on April 5th with a lecture from Andrzej Ceglarz. Thank you, everyone, and we're looking forward to seeing you again. Goodbye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.